This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. I'm Marianne Azevedo, and as you may have noticed, we're shaking things up here on Equity, and today is no different. Instead of our usual interview show today, I'm joined by TechCrunch senior reporter Christine Hall and my new Equity co-host, Haya Camps. Christine, Haya, hello. So happy to have you here.
Hello.
Hello. It's so good to be here. I'm so happy to sit here in this very luxurious co-host chair.
Well, it suits you well. So, Christine, we are talking about a story today that you and I worked on together for months.
Yes.
It was about an accelerator that is now defunct called Newchip, was based here in Austin, Texas, where I'm located. And wow, to say there was a lot going on here is an understatement.
Yes.
This accelerator went bankrupt or filed for bankruptcy last year. And, the drama didn't end there. All sorts of things have gone down since then. So we're here to kind of dissect and discuss today.
It's been such an interesting thing to follow you guys covering this story. So it seems like a big part of the problem with this bankruptcy is related to warrants. And, I'm guessing we don't mean police warrants here. What are warrants and why does this matter in the context of an accelerator?
Yeah. So to describe warrants, I'll try to simplify this as much as possible. So when they signed up for this accelerator program, startups granted Newchip the right to buy $250,000 worth of shares in their company at a later date, but at their current valuation. So that type of deal is known as a warrant. Now, there was some question about how explicitly this was detailed to founders when they first signed on. So when I spoke with the sales agent, he told me that not all of the warrants were enforceable because the company admitted to not having been clear enough earlier on in the process, but apparently revised language later. So the warrants that were considered more enforceable were ones that were granted a little bit later in Newchip's life.
And so if I understand that correctly then, is that basically these startups went in there and they said, hey, we want to be part of this accelerator. Did they pay money to be part of the accelerator?
Yes. Yeah, some paid $7,500. A lot of people told us that. Some people paid a little bit less depending on what they wanted to do.
Some paid more.
Some paid more. Yes.
Yeah. It ranged between a few $1,000s, I think, and up to over $10,000, $15,000, depending on what they agreed to. They were promised things like being introduced to investors. That was just one of the things that they were promised, and just kind of being helped just to grow, like coaching, growing their companies. But I think one of the biggest claims was, we'll help you get introduced to the right investors.
Yeah.
Yes, and that didn't transpire for a lot of people. In fact, a lot of the people that I spoke to actually were having an okay time with the accelerator. They were meeting peer founders and having a good time, and were actually enjoying the conversations that they were having. And so it was really sad, if you will, to see it kind of crash and burn like that.
Yeah, totally. I feel like most of the accelerators I'm aware of, I've done a couple myself, they either give you money
Yes.
or they cost nothing. So how did these founders decide that it was a good idea to pay money to an accelerator?
Yeah, good question.
That's a good question.
I think that's one of the things being called into question right now is like, why would companies agree to pay money to an accelerator? And did that really actually pan out into anything valuable for them? So, again, there's a lot of mixed things going on here. Some people said there was value in the program. Others said there weren't, that they didn't really get much out of it. It depends really on who you talk to. When the company filed for bankruptcy, it supposedly had about $4.8 million in total liabilities, $1.7 million in total assets. A lot of people said that Andrew Ryan, who was the CEO, was very smart, but that his leadership style really kind of hurt the company's growth. There was a lot of turnover. Employees ended up walking out at one point. I think it was before the bankruptcy filing because they wanted him to step down as CEO. And so there was just a lot of internal problems that led to the company sort of falling apart. And also, again, some of the customer complaints. Now, one thing that is kind of in question, though, is did the company actually really need to file for bankruptcy? Because all those warrants that we talked about were not taken into account. They were not listed as assets when the company first filed for Chapter 11 debt reorg and then went into Chapter 7. And they were not, if they had been listed as assets, then maybe Newchip wouldn't have had to go into bankruptcy.
Right.
And then maybe all these people who claim they lost money either by not getting refunds or in other ways wouldn't have had to be going through what they went through. So that's one of the things that's kind of being called into question now. And sorry, I feel like we're going a little bit all over the place, but there's a lot of moving parts here. So why would they pay? Yeah, I can't really answer why they would pay. I wouldn't say that all of them regretted it. I would say obviously the ones we talked to did.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that they could say that too. Also, I'm not sure that they thought that that was wrong, to be honest with you. I think that they thought that they were, paying to get something. And so I think maybe the complaint is more they paid and didn't get something. Because like I said, there were a lot of people who enjoyed it and they were doing just fine. It was until they wasn't doing fine that they started to have a problem. So they didn't have a problem paying the money or else they wouldn't have paid it or they would have not, done the accelerator, but they seemed to be okay with it at the time.
Yeah. I feel like that's a pretty common thing for contract law though, right? You go into the agreement in the hope that everything will be good, but the time you actually end up fine reading your contract is when everything has gone to hell.
Yes.
And it sounds like that happened here.
Yeah.
I'm working on a couple of other articles where I'm talking to a bunch of people who went through accelerators and all that kind of thing. And it seems like a lot of the accelerators that popped up, especially in the heyday of the last 5 years or so, a lot of it is amateur hour, where it feels like people, like the startups are a little bit desperate. Maybe the companies aren't as high quality, so they won't get into like a Y Combinator or what have you. And then they kind of go, well, we need to learn this somehow. And in that universe, maybe it makes sense to pay $15,000 to an accelerator to learn these things. But my experience with those kinds of companies, like when they go and raise further funding later, the new investors are like, okay, what is going on with these founders, right? It's not like, It seems like the founders didn't really know what they're signing up for, which is a really big red flag for following funding.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point, Haya, and I think that's part of the problem right now and what we were trying to cover in our story is, A, some of these founders maybe didn't read the fine print closely enough, didn't understand what they were signing when they agreed to let Newchip have the ability to buy this, shares into their company. And so how that really backfired on them is when the company filed for bankruptcy, the court said, okay, well, we realize now you have all these warrants. Supposedly, according to a study by a venture fund here in Austin that was actually early an investor in Newchip, they claimed that the warrants were worth just under $500 million. So they decided, well, we want you to be able to pay back your creditors. You're going to have to sell these warrants. And so they put them on the auction block, which imagine you're a founder, you sign up for an accelerator, you think you're going to get introduced to investors and hopefully raise capital, and then find yourselves where your company is being auctioned off to the highest bidder. And let's face it, not probably going to get very much for these warrants. This is what has happened. This is why founders were outraged and why this story kind of went crazy, because people were just horrified by this, like being in this situation, even if you're a little naive, even if you're, a little bit amateurish, founders really never expect that this is going to happen to them. And it's a lot of people in social media said, take this as a cautionary tale. Be very, very careful when you sign up for any kind of program. Read the fine print. You don't want to be in this situation. There were people who said, look, I signed up for this. I asked for a refund. I did get my refund, but still that part of the contract was binding. So they were still facing their warrants being sold off to the highest bidder. And there were people who objected to the sale in court and argued and fought. Their objections were shut down. And it's still not over. There are still about 1,400, I think, or 1,500 that are going to be auctioned off this summer. And these founders have the ability to object, but the ones that objected earlier this year were shot down. So let's face it, these ones are probably going to be shot down as well.
Yeah. So I do a lot of work with early stage companies, and this kind of thing isn't entirely unusual. It's pretty rare, right? But occasionally you do end up with a cap table that's not ideal, shall we say. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, if you are a company that is making hay, right? You're on an exponential growth curve and you're doing great, your new investors will go to bat for you. Ultimately it's 200K on the cap table, whatever, right? If you are becoming a multi-billion-dollar company, Would it be better if it wasn't there? Sure, but there are ways of negotiating that. I think the companies that are really heavily affected are the ones that are doing poorly and kind of medium good, because nobody's going to spend the effort and money and heartache and headaches of picking a fight in the legal system to clean this up. And so I think there's an interesting piece here where, yes, this will probably end a whole bunch of startups because they're now deemed as incredibly high risk. But, this is a business of high risk. I feel like if there's 100, how many companies are we talking about?
I mean, we're talking about thousands.
Right. So out of those thousands companies, there will be a handful, maybe a dozen, that people will still figure out. Now, the thing that really sucks is that the kind of people who sign up for this kind of thing are often first-time founders, right? And you end up in this really nasty situation where there's essentially no way through because, And so as an investor, I'm like, yeah, cool. You can deal with it if you have to. As somebody who works with founders, I'm like, ouch, this is such a horrible situation to be in.
Exactly. Christine actually talked firsthand with one of the founders about their experiences, and she'll share all the details around that. But first, a short break. What's next in tech? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, where an entrepreneurial ecosystem pulses with connectivity, capability, and possibility, where the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. fast-track success, and hard work is rewarded with sunsets and turquoise waters. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. investpr.org/TechCrunch. Christine talked to one founder, and I'll let you share that story, Christina Lacey Hunter.
Yeah. Hers was interesting, kind of touched on all of the things that you talked about, Hayo, about she just essentially had to shut down her company because she tried to get the warrants back. She offered money. They basically said no. What was interesting was she actually went and talked to other potential investors. And one of the banks that she went to actually worked with her. She said it was so amazing. They worked with her for so long trying to figure out how to get her out of this situation. And at the end of the day, they just said, you know what, look, we can't risk your cap table having somebody on there that we can't work with as a bank. And so we just can't, we've taken it as far as we can go and we can't go any further with it. And so she was just like, okay, well, I guess I have no choice but to, shut it down, which to your point too, not only did these people pay to get into this program, but that could have been a lot of the money that they had. So they don't have, another, $5,000 or however it costs to get a lawyer and to go to court and battle for the things that they have.
Yeah. And one thing I want to point out, so the warrants were being sold in 3 tranches. The first one involved 133 companies, which had raised collectively over $300 million in funding. The sales agent ultimately ended up selling, out of those 133 startups, 28 warrants in just 4 companies, okay, for a total of about $58,000. So that gives you an idea of what these warrants are selling for.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the successful bidders in 2 of the companies, it was the companies themselves that bought back their own warrants in advance for $5,000 each, according to an agreement with the trustee. Those ones were able to work out something. And then the others, one was Palm Ventures was a buyer, and then an Angel Deal Syndicate, formal name, Angel Deal Syndicate, purchased the bulk of the warrants, spending $43,000 on warrants in 24 companies. So the second tranche, which is going to be sold this summer, most likely will include over 1,400 warrants for sale. So basically, whoever does end up buying these warrants are probably going to get a bargain. But I guess one might argue, to your point, Haya, I don't really know the quality of all these companies anyway. Mm-hmm. So bargain, I guess, is a relative term. It is safe to say that, they won't be paying that much, considering that those 133 had raised over $340 million in funding, and yet the sales agent was only able to get about $58,000 in an auction.
I mean, from the buyer's point of view, this is actually a really interesting one, right? If you can say, okay, here's $50,000, I want all the warrants, but it means you don't have to exercise the warrants, right? So you're just sitting there with the right to buy chunks of a company. Now, if later you see one of them is taking off like a scalded dog, and it's like, wait a minute, this is the next Facebook or Uber or Google or whatever, of course you exercise your option. That's when you find $200,000 somewhere, put it in the company. But it basically becomes this really interesting spread betting kind of futures type situation where you have a right to buy something. I mean, I think from the buyer's point of view, it's super clever, even though it really sucks for the startups who ended up in the situation.
Right. I mean, unless they get a buyer who actually is willing to invest in them in more than just buying the warrants, but like maybe really helping them grow or go on to raise more money. I think in general, Newchip, just didn't keep up with the warrants very well. It actually, according to a person who served as an interim CFO for the company after the initial bankruptcy filing, that the management hadn't really kept up to them enough to the point where they actually missed that some of the companies that went through the program had exited or raised more money. So the claim is that Newchip identified about $54 million in warrant value from companies that had liquidity events that should have been reported to Newchip, but were not. So this honestly seems like a little bit of a hot mess all around internally before the bankruptcy filing.
Yeah, that's wild. Just to kind of broaden the view a little bit, we've talked about Techstars on an earlier show. We've talked about a bunch of other accelerators, some of them good, some of them slightly more on the, shall we say, not good side of the scale. Is this a trend? Is this something that startups should be on the lookout for? Or is this kind of a blip on the radar that is a one-off?
I hope it's not a trend. I hope it's just a blip, honestly.
That's a tough thing to say. I know Techstars is a little bit different because it is a much larger accelerator program than Newchip, for example. And, it had a really great reputation for a long time. I will say, though, that after Christine and I reported on Newchip, we did get emails from people saying, hey, I can tell you other stories like this. So that kind of makes me think that this is, I don't want to use the word trend, but it's not as uncommon as we would think or hope, unfortunately. I don't want to say that the people who start these accelerators necessarily all have bad intentions. I'm not saying that at all. But I feel like if you're a founder, you're just having to be extra careful in deciding what program you decide to get into. And I think that's why, to be honest with you, even though Y Combinator's had a lot of kind of negative headlines here and there, people still gravitate toward it because you see YC companies go on to raise a lot of money or become very successful or have good exits or attract very well-known investors. So there's that credibility that still persists with YC. And that's why as stories like this keep coming out, it's going to be harder and harder for accelerators that are smaller. And even the really honorable, well-intentioned ones might struggle to attract people.
Yeah. Well, I think the truth that we've seen for a long time is that there is 3 or 4 accelerators that everybody knows their names and they are the top of the crop, right? That's if you're going to apply for an accelerator, Newchip probably wasn't your first application, right?
Right.
You did Y Combinator, Techstars, back in the day, 500 startups and a bunch of the others that were very, very well regarded. And then you kind of work your way down the list and eventually you end up with one that'll say yes. But maybe as a founder, that's the indication that maybe, oh, wait a minute, I'm so far down this list now. I'm like, it's not blue chip anymore. We're talking like different types of accelerators. Maybe that's the way that maybe people need to spend a little bit of time thinking.
Well, bottom line, you have to deliver.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was saying, like bottom line, I think the accelerator programs have to deliver what they're saying. I think for Newchip, they were telling us that they were going to be able to meet the investors at demo day. Well, they didn't make it to demo day. So why weren't they being introduced to investors from day one? That would have been the more prudent thing to do.
Yeah, I think in Newchip's case too, let's be clear that there were a lot of struggles internally. Again, the CEO had a very harsh leadership style that resulted in a lot of turnover. And I think that kind of influenced the demise of the company or the accelerator program. There's no doubt that he was very intelligent and that the concept for Newchip was not a bad one. But when there is leadership that could be considered or was described as abusive and resulted in people, for example, one of the stories we were told is one of the managers was fired in front of his peers for not being adequately prepared for a meeting. And he claimed he felt like he was being set up and was sort of humiliated, whereas the CEO was like, hey, maybe that was harsh, but, I viewed what he did, not being prepared, as an act of overt subordination. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of the way this company was run.
It seemed too like he was putting his focus into things that were not something that needed to be focused. Because as you mentioned, Marianne, they completely missed all of these exits and things that they should have been paying attention to. But in fact, he's paying attention to people not coming to a meeting with proper research or ready to present or something. And I think that that's not something that he should have been focused on, and rather focused on some things that would have helped the accelerator get where it needed to be.
Yeah. Well, and it's an interesting thing, right? There's a lot of people who, to your point from earlier, Marianne, there's this thing like nobody goes into this, or hopefully nobody goes into this with like nefarious thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But incompetence, there's a famous saying, don't ascribe to malice that can be ascribed to incompetence. And I feel like that is happening in a lot of, especially the smaller accelerators, where people have a lot of like, they want to make an ecosystem happen. They want to build something with these startups. And it's true that a lot of things about running a startup is kind of universal, so you can teach that universally. But startups are startups, and every one of them has different needs, different skill sets, different experiences, different everything. And it's incredibly hard to customize a accelerator to something that works for everyone. And so I think it's really fascinating to see how this one fell apart and how others, like I've got some interesting stories in the hopper. When I hit publish on those, we'll have another one of these conversations. But what I'm saying is that I wish there was a way for founders to really learn what to look out for. And hopefully this podcast can help with that. But also every new pitfall is a new pitfall.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's a tough thing, right? When you're a startup founder and you're early in your process and you're excited and you have hope and there's someone kind of promising you all these great things, it's easy to get caught up in that and buy into it. So yeah, I think the advice we can just offer is do take the time to be very careful to read language in anything you sign. And if that means spending a little bit up front to get a lawyer to look at something, maybe it's worth it. Then potentially, being in the situation that a lot of startups that went through the Newchip program have found themselves in.
Yeah. And I think the extra important thing to note there is anything to do with equity. Anytime you give up shares in your company, that's a time to pause, think it through. Because there is no easy way to get somebody off your cap table.
Yes.
Like once you have somebody who is part of your company that way, like legally, it is almost impossible to remove them. If you sign a contract with the wrong people, there's no way of undoing that. And that's incredibly painful for startups.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Where you could one day end up having investors on your cap table that you never would have dreamed of or have agreed to if you'd had a choice. So, okay, well, we're going to have to wrap this up today. But Christine and Haya, thank you so much for being on this show with us this week and talking through this with me. Christine, please tell our listeners where they can find you and read more of your amazing work.
Yeah, thank you for having me. You can find me on X and LinkedIn, and of course, the TechCrunch website.
What's your handle on X?
X is Christine M. Hall. Real easy.
Haya, what about you?
Well, I write for this wonderful website called TechCrunch, so come find me there. And I'm on X at Haya.
Awesome. And Haya, you will be hearing more of because we will be back with Equity on Friday with our weekly news roundup. And he's going to be on the show every week. We're going to be riffing and talking about all the hot and exciting and not so great stuff happening in the startup world. Until Friday, you can find us under the handle at EquityPod on X and Threads. Don't forget to check out our sister show Found, which dives deep into the stories behind startups with the founders who built them. Thanks for listening. Bye. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.